I'm Ken Bibrai, and welcome to Coffee with Ken, a thought leadership series at the nexus of business, politics, and the Canadian US border today. So excited to welcome Beth Burke, the president of the Canadian American Business Council, for Coffee with Ken. Great to see you, Beth. How are you?
Great to see you, Ken. Thanks so much for having me.
We booked this a little while ago, and since booking it, the U.S. and Canada went to blows in hockey. We are talking tear-offs. Like the Wall Street Journal had a cover the other day, and it said like after 150 years of friendship, the U.S. and Canada come to blows. Like what is going on?
It's an interesting time, that is for sure. I think, hockey is always a competitive sport and always a competitive
Metaphor.
time. But, I think the relationship's in an interesting place right now. I am one of those people who likes to look at things from a Pollyanna half glass half full position and say that this relationship has been so important for so long that there's no option other than to thrive and to continue to be strong. But yeah, we're in some tough times right now.
Amazing. Well, let's dive into that, right? Like your organization is focused on supporting Canadian American business, commerce. And it wasn't until we booked this call with you and started paying a little bit more attention that you really appreciate the significance of this relationship between the US and Canada. So, talk a little bit more about that, right? Like, tell us about the organization, what you've been advocating for, and how you're dealing with this new climate, if you will.
Sure, absolutely. So the Canadian American Business Council has been around for over 30 years. We are solely focused on supporting and strengthening the US Canada relationship. And we do that through a variety of ways. But really, it's that we would like to ensure that the countries face the world challenges together. So, our membership is comprised of both Americans and Canadians. While we are a US headquartered company, we are the only bilateral business organization focused on the US Canada relationship. So I always say that we're unique because we are home team no matter what side of the border we're on. Um, and, we really do represent every industry. We have folks from the energy and natural resources space, consumer goods, transportation, you know, an option and we've got them in some capacity. Um, we really focus on how strong our economic relationship is between Canada and the US. You alluded to this earlier, but 400,000 people cross the border every day and it's about $3 billion of goods and services that move. So it is not an insignificant relationship, but sometimes people on this side of the border maybe forget about how important our neighbors to the north are. So we really bring together businesses, leaders, policymakers from both sides of the border to have conversations to really develop an economic atmosphere that helps business thrive on both sides.
So were you surprised by this kind of more aggressive take on tariffs and kind of targeting Canada, right? Like obviously President Trump worked with Canada and Mexico during his first administration, right? There was success with USMCA, right? Like talk a little bit about Trump administration 1 versus 2 and this kind of pivot in tone toward Canada.
Yeah, so, I think I wouldn't say I was surprised. I think President Trump has been clear all along what his intention is, around strengthening production in the United States. But to your point, he also was the negotiator and signer of the USMCA. It was one of his largest legislative accomplishments in his first term. And the business community really has grabbed hold of that agreement and situated ourselves in a place that really operates as a North American unit as opposed to purely an American or purely a Canadian company. And so I think it's important for us to, look at how far our supply chains and our economic integration have come even since the original signing of the USMCA. Um, but also sort of where we are from a political landscape is different. There is much more of a populist undertone and a little bit more bring things back home, not just in America, but globally. I mean, that is something that we're seeing everywhere. So, no, I'm not surprised. But I am quite hopeful that we can find a path that instead of looking at barriers and things that put us at odds or competitive nature between Canada and the US that we can find opportunities where we can really double down and strengthen this really important economic relationship.
Yeah. And so much of I think the president's commentary wasn't just economic, it was about fentanyl and drugs and other things. So talk a little bit about what do you see from the US side as kind of, the ask of Canada ahead of
Well, yeah, I
the
mean,
of
so
tariff. Like,
the first threat of tariffs was, sort of dangled around Thanksgiving, and it kind of has continued through since then. And the cliff we almost came on for February 1st when tariffs were going to be levied at Canada if they weren't willing to come to the table and talk about fentanyl and border security. And, Canada really took that to heart. They have since installed a fentanyl czar. They've taken a lot of steps. They've put a lot of money towards strengthening the border. The premiers from across the country have all stepped up and said that each province is also, willing to shoulder some of the responsibility to tighten the security at the borders. And look, I think it's a good thing for both countries, right? To have a secure border is not just a win for the US, but it's also important for Canada. So, the next test is really going to be, did Canada and Mexico achieve the level of success around border security that the president wants, right? He has said that if those metrics have been met, there could be another potential pause on tariffs that were, supposed to be set. So if that happens, then, we're looking down the road. I think something that is important to remember, though, is that even if there's another pause, I don't think the conversation or the idea of tariffs between our friendly nations is going to just evaporate overnight. I think that the president has shown it's a tool he believes is extremely powerful and useful in extracting some wins for the United States.
the Canadians seem to have taken this to heart. I think you had all 13 premiers come to Washington and you took them around. Talk a little bit about that. I mean,
Yeah.
you have a bit of a political background. You know the Hall of DC, right? Which is why I think you're running this organization. But this was probably like a real opportunity to kind of, roll up your sleeves and some good old shoe leather through the Capitol, right?
Yeah, it was great. So the Canadian American Business Council actually hosted a luncheon where all the premiers came to DC to have conversations and tell the story and highlight the economic relationship as well as the work that they're doing on the border. So we had a luncheon with our members and all the premiers that were in town to talk about what does the relationship look like today? Where are we going from here? What stories should be strengthened and highlighted? One of the other things we talked a lot about, which we actually haven't touched on yet, but I think is an important part of this conversation, is there are repercussions beyond tariffs that can happen in these types of relationships, right? So, non tariff barriers that countries can put into place as retaliation or reciprocation. And we, at the Canadian American Business Council, don't think those are productive. And so we had a lot of conversation around keeping the relationship strong and positive and finding those opportunities, which I mentioned earlier. I think there's a long list of opportunities that Canada and the US have to really strengthen projects like infrastructure projects, critical mineral processing and movement across the border. There's just a lot of opportunities here that I think instead of being competitive with one another, being collaborative and finding ways to make it work for both countries will be a huge important opportunity.
Yeah, so our firm is a global firm, Savills, where I work, and I've been spending a lot of time with my Canadian colleagues as the DC guy discussing this. And one of the things that's really been an eye opener for us, kind of as we work across borders, our own company has been kind of the auto industry, right? And I don't think
Mhm.
there's a more kind of acute example of this kind of free flow between the border of auto parts that literally go, right? Like, talk about the auto industry as kind of a very specific industry where this collaboration is happening daily that would have the most kind of impact on American consumers potentially as well in a negative way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the North American auto supply is the supply chain
Yeah.
is so interconnected. Parts will move back and forth across the border 7, 10, 13 times before a car is actually fully completed. And if you imagine the compounding effect of tariffs each time it crossed the border, the prices would skyrocket for consumers. They would be limiting for manufacturers, which could impact jobs in very important communities across both countries. It's significant. And it's a perfect example, like I said earlier, about how business has really shifted and adjusted to be more North American focused around the original agreement of USMCA. And so we just have to be cognizant of the fact that not everything is or can be fully made in the United States today. And so, in the process of that, like, what does that mean for this relationship? What does that mean for this industry? Well, it means significant impacts, which will be felt by everyday Americans and everyday Canadians.
Fascinating. It's one of those things like if you're a Canadian company, what are you hearing from the members? Are they thinking about just waiting to see what the president does and how this shakes out? Are they making plans for expansion potentially to the United States? I mean, how are they thinking about the long term strategy of kind of their own companies, supply chain, and doing business in the United States?
Well, I think you bring up a really important point, right? Businesses thrive and operate on certainty, predictability, and forward planning. And it's really hard to be aggressively forward planning when you don't know what the landscape is going to be. And so I will say that I have heard from some members that they are pulling back on investments that they were intending to make in the United States
Okay.
or vice versa. People that were planning to expand their operations into Canada may be pulling back because they don't know what this relationship may mean or look like. Um, but I do think there are some businesses who are really trying to be optimistic and find opportunities to say, okay, yes, the tariffs are a problem. Yes, this is something that would be very challenging for us, but let's tell our story and let's talk about how we can move a product back and forth, or we're a US based company that has one product line, made in Canada. What would that mean for US consumers or vice versa? If Canada were to boycott any American company, what does it do to the jobs that are from the plant that may be in Canada that's producing this one American line? I mean, there are ripples and, you know, you can't understate how interconnected we are.
Yeah. No, no, I mean, this is a very fluid, long-standing cooperative relationship, not only from security, but from commerce and even just citizens and tourism and travel.
Yeah.
Clearly, as you look at the kind of political landscape, right? We're in the United States with a new administration coming in. The prime minister announced that he's going to be stepping down. What's the political dynamic at play in Canada, and how is that impacting some of these conversations and negotiations with the U.S.?
Well, it's another interesting point, and I think it's something people in the US don't fully appreciate how dynamic and complicated the situation is.
Hmm.
So, when Prime Minister Trudeau stepped down, there became a leadership election which is happening on March 9th. So, on March 9th, there will be a new prime minister. Um, that will be one of the liberal leader candidates who's currently running. Then that they have the opportunity to potentially hold the, you know, minority government for as long as they can until maybe NDP or Bloc pull their support. And at that point, then we would trigger an election, or the new candidate could just call an election immediately, which means we could see a Canadian federal election happen probably as early as April or May. And or it could go to October or even beyond, frankly. It's a little complicated, and, the dynamics of this conversation around tariffs is changing the political landscape in Canada. Um, I think it's yet to be determined how that election will play out, and I don't pretend to be a pollster up there, but what I can tell you is just reading the polls, at one point, the Conservatives were 30 points ahead. That's no longer the case.
Okay.
So I think it's really anyone's guess at this point about how this will play out. Um, but those dynamics come to play because if you're thinking about how we are going to negotiate and navigate some of these conversations, having, a leader north of the border to do that and to have real partnerships with their counterparts in the US, it's complicated.
Yeah. No, no, it's live time and lots of things seem to be happening all at once, right? So
Exactly.
let's say the date passes. Let's say President Trump takes a hard line and isn't happy, right? Like, are both sides of the border prepared for like the economic impact, or are people just waiting to see if this is gonna just resolve itself, or you seeing businesses on both sides kind of making serious investments for a dire situation?
Yeah, I mean, businesses are nimble, right? Like we have always planned for A, B, C, and D contingencies, right? Like that's how businesses operate. So I do think there everyone's making plans to the best of their ability, but like I said, uncertainty and really having no idea of where this is going to land is challenging. So we'll see. I also know that the governments I'm specifically speaking of Canada and US, but I know Mexico as well, they're all having the conversations, running the exercises. What does this mean? How do we respond? What does that response then, elicit on this side and so forth? Where does the snowball end? So I think everyone's preparing to the best of their ability, but I really do believe in my heart of hearts that everybody is hopeful that we can come to a good resolution where tariffs are not levied at that high of a 25%.
Sure, sure. And talk about the relationship more broadly, right? It has been so ironclad. Is this going to be a blip in the relationship, or do you think this kind of moment in time is creating a lasting kind of challenge in the broader U.S. Canadian relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think of the US Canada relationship somewhat like a marriage, which I don't know, I've said before, it's sort of like, when you've been married for so long, sometimes you don't really do much for your spouse's birthday or whatever. And, you'll survive because you've been together forever. Is it nice to get the flowers? Is it nice to get the card? Of course. But in this case, I think we've all gone through challenging times with our significant others, and I think that is what this is, right? It may be a recalibration of the relationship, and I think that's okay, right? We see that move forward, but I just don't think there's any way that the marriage between Canada and US will go away.
So the other underlying kind of theme that has emerged over the last several weeks has been this notion of you know expansion of U.S. kind of control and potential statehood, and talk about that. I mean, how serious is that? We all kind of, I think, I don't want to say blow it off, but it's kind of doesn't feel like a realistic thing. But I think from the Canadian perspective, folks there are genuinely kind of wondering, and obviously the president can't help himself and calling Prime Minister Trudeau governor, right? Like, is this a real thing? Is it a negotiation tactic? Is this something the Canadian side is spending serious time thinking about or preparing for?
You know, as an American, I think it is our nature to sort of laugh it off as a joke and say, okay, this isn't serious. This is him exerting his position and showing how much leverage he has in the relationship or what have you. But I think we should also remember how it would feel if someone were saying that about the United States. I've heard a lot of people talking about how mad they are that Canadians are booing the national anthem at sporting events. But I mean, you know, it doesn't feel great. But I also think we have to sort of appreciate the fact that their sovereignty is being questioned, at least to some extent. And how would we react as American citizens if someone was trying to belittle our sovereignty? It's not a joke to them. And, we need to be respectful of their place in the world. But personally, I sort of tend to believe that this is Trump um, doing what he does best, right? Like being extreme and bombastic and sort of making his point through a broader statement that he doesn't necessarily mean. You know,
Yeah. So I want to kind of close on a more positive note about the relationship more broadly, right? Because your organization has spent time building these strong bridges with industry and so on. And it
that's
strikes me as Canada being such a strong trade partner, whether it's the Port of Vancouver or natural resources, right? Like, flipping this from a conversation around like tariffs to exert pressure to, shouldn't we be more focused on building stronger economic ties and opportunities, right? Like, on a normal day, if you weren't dealing with this, what would you be focused on? What would you be pushing Washington? So I'd love to kind of hear your call to action. Like,
and absolutely. I'm actually trying to walk and chew gum at the same time. So, we are trying to be responsive to the tariffs, but
of
also,
course.
you know, really focusing on these opportunities, right? You
Sure.
mentioned it. I think critical minerals is one of the biggest places that we have huge opportunities. Canada has more processing facilities than the United States does. They have capacity. I think should be looking to partner with them. I mean, energy at large actually is a really important relationship. Even if you look at oil and gas, the United States imports oil from Canada, but then we process, refine it, and we sell it. So we're making a profit. I mean, there is very much a mutual relationship here that is beneficial. I also think one of the biggest areas of opportunities that I see is um, regulatory cooperation and cohesion. I think there are a lot of red tape barriers when you move back and forth across the border or when you're trying to, fulfill regulations on both sides of the border. It's a lot of the same paperwork in different boxes and different forms, whatever, that businesses have to spend a lot of time complying. And I think there would be a huge opportunity to cut massive amounts of overhead and spend on things if Canada and the US could more closely align. We have something called the Regulatory Cooperation Council between Canada and US. It's housed in the Treasury Board in Canada and OMB in the United States. And it is a really collaborative place to try and find the opportunities to trim the fat, if you will, to find opportunities that we can have one form that's universally accepted. And I think that is such a huge opportunity. I would love to spend more time working on that and really standing up the cooperation between the two countries. The other thing that we've yet to mention that I feel like I have to before we wrap is
Yeah.
national security. I mean, we are we have joint command at NORAD. That is such a unique situation where we have Canadians and Americans serving together to protect our, you know, homeland. And I think it's really important and unique. And I think there's lots of opportunities to expand that collaboration. Also, looking at the Arctic security and other places where Canada and the US can work together to keep North America strong.
That's amazing. Well, Beth, we're so grateful that you took some time to be with us. I know your schedule's been a little wild over the last few weeks, and we're all going to be closely monitoring everything happening. And just like you, I think we're really focused on seeing what are the more exciting, positive, fruitful, tangible initiatives that can continue to move forward between Canada and the United States. I know we're working with our Canadian colleagues about supporting Canadian companies that want to do more business here, and they're supporting more American companies that want to expand and do more in Canada. So thanks for everything you do, and we're excited to have you.
Thank you.
Appreciate everybody tuning in. It's coffeewithken.com, and make sure you subscribe and keep in touch.
Thanks so
All right,
much.
good to see you.